First story, The Family at Camp, 1976. I still get chills every time I think about that night in the Rockies. It was supposed to be a peaceful camping trip, a chance for my family to disconnect and enjoy nature. It was me, my wife, and our two kids, Ethan, who was 12 at the time, and little Maddie, who was only 8. We had set up camp in a secluded spot not far from a crystal-clear stream. It was late July, and the weather was perfect, clear skies with stars that seemed to go on forever. After dinner, we sat around the fire, telling stories and roasting marshmallows, laughing like we didn't have a care in the world. When the kids got sleepy, we all climbed into the tent together, with Maddie curling up beside me and Ethan sprawled out on the other side. I remember feeling so at peace, like nothing in the world could touch us out there. But then, just as I was starting to drift off, I saw something through the thin fabric of the tent. A strange, faint glow, like someone was shining a flashlight just beyond the tree line. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. I blinked a few times, but the light didn't go away. Instead, it grew brighter, shifting colors from a pale white to an eerie blue, and then to a green that lit up the entire campsite. I nudged my wife, whispering, "Do you see that?" She groggily looked up and gasped as the light seemed to pulse and hum. A sound so low, it almost felt like it was coming from inside my chest. The kids woke up too, their faces pale with confusion. Ethan tried to brush it off, mumbling something about fireflies, but Maddie was terrified. "Daddy, what is it?" she asked, her voice trembling. Before I could even think of how to answer, the hum got louder, vibrating through the air, and the light shot upward into the sky in a streak so fast it made my head spin. It hovered there, almost motionless, like it was watching us. The fire was out now, snuffed by what I can only describe as a wave of energy that came off the light. Everything was dead silent except for that low, bone-deep hum. The next thing I remember is waking up in a panic. It was still dark, but something felt wrong. My head was pounding, my mouth dry as sandpaper, and my body ached in places I didn't even know could hurt. When I sat up, I realized the kids were already awake, sitting quietly with wide, glassy eyes. My wife was beside me, holding Maddie, but her face was blank, like she wasn't fully there. "What time is it?" I croaked, but no one answered. That's when Ethan finally spoke, his voice shaky. "I had the weirdest dream." He didn't need to explain it though, because as soon as he said it, I felt the memories flooding back. It wasn't just a dream. It was something more vivid, more real than anything I'd ever experienced. I remembered lying on a cold, metallic surface, unable to move, with bright, blinding lights above me. Shadows moved around, their shapes impossibly thin and tall, with elongated heads and eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. They didn't speak, but I felt their presence, like they were inside my mind, sifting through my thoughts. And they were touching me, cold, probing hands that made my skin crawl. The worst part was how powerless I felt, like I wasn't even human anymore, just an object they were inspecting. Ethan's words broke the eerie silence, but what chilled me to the core was when Maddie whispered, "I saw them too." She clung to my wife's arm, her voice shaking. They had big eyes and they kept looking at me, like they wanted to see inside my head. My wife didn't say anything, but I could see it in her face. She had the same dream, or whatever it was. I tried to brush it off as a coincidence, as some kind of mass hallucination, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the truth. The details were too vivid, too specific. Ethan described the same cold table, the same figures, and even the same feeling of being completely paralyzed, helpless under their control. Maddie, in her little voice, mentioned how one of them leaned close to her, its face mere inches from hers, and how it made a strange clicking sound that vibrated in her skull. The more they talked, the more my skin crawled. My wife finally spoke, her voice trembling but steady. I felt them take something from me, like they reached inside without touching. That sentence hit me like a punch to the gut because I had felt it too, like they were taking pieces of me I didn't even know existed. We sat there in that suffocating silence, none of us sure what to say or do. My logical mind tried to find explanations. Bad dreams brought on by the strange lights, maybe some kind of gas leak that messed with our heads. But none of it added up. My body felt off, like it didn't quite belong to me anymore. There was a strange mark on my forearm, almost like a small, perfectly round bruise, and when I showed it to my wife, her face went pale. She pulled up her sleeve to reveal an identical mark on her arm. Ethan and Maddie had them too, the same size, in the exact same spot. My stomach dropped, and I felt this overwhelming need to get us out of there, to put as much distance as possible between us and that place. I stumbled out of the tent, my legs shaky, and looked around. The woods were completely still, not a single chirp from a bird or rustle of leaves. The air felt heavy, like something was pressing down on us. And then I saw it, a faint glow far in the distance, pulsing like it was breathing. My first instinct was to pack up and leave immediately, but something about that light held me frozen in place. It was far off, deeper into the woods, but it felt like it was watching us, waiting for us to move. My wife came out of the tent and stood beside me, her eyes fixed on the glow. "Do you think it's them?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't answer because I didn't know. All I knew was that we had to leave, but at the same time, my legs wouldn't move. It was like the air around us was thicker than water, keeping us stuck there, forcing us to watch. I finally broke out of the trance and started grabbing our gear, throwing everything haphazardly into the car. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely zip the bags. Ethan and Maddie just stood there, their faces pale and blank, like they were in a daze. My wife tried to help, but she kept glancing back at the light, her breathing shallow and uneven. By the time we got everything packed, the glow had disappeared, but the hum, it was still there, faint but persistent, like it was inside my head, now instead of the air around us. We drove out of there as fast as we could. The kids sat silently in the back, clutching each other like their lives depended on it. My wife kept looking out the window, her hand gripping my arm every time we hit a curve, as if she was afraid the light would reappear. The road back to civilization was long and winding, and every shadow in the trees felt alive. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those glowing lights chasing us. But the scariest part was the silence. Maddie, usually so chatty, didn't make a single sound. Ethan stared at his lap, and I could see his lips moving slightly, like he was whispering to himself, though no words came out. I wanted to say something to comfort them, but how could I when I didn't even know what had happened? My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly they ached, and my heart pounded in my chest the entire drive. The hum had finally stopped, but the silence it left behind was almost worse. It was like the world had been drained of something vital, and we were driving through a hollow version of it. When we finally got to a motel hours later, the exhaustion hit us all at once. We barely spoke as we dragged ourselves inside, locking the door and double-checking the windows like it would actually keep them out. I took a shower to try to shake the feeling of grime and dread off me, but when I looked in the mirror, I froze. The mark on my arm had darkened, and it wasn't just a bruise. It had a strange texture, almost like a burn, but it didn't hurt to touch. I stepped closer to the mirror and noticed something even more unsettling. There was a faint line of tiny dots beneath the bruise, almost like a pattern. My stomach churned as I traced it with my finger, the realization hitting me like a freight train. This wasn't natural. It wasn't something you could get from bumping into a tree or falling on a rock. This was deliberate. I threw on my clothes and rushed out to check on the others. Ethan and Maddie were already asleep, but my wife was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at her arm. She had the same pattern, faint but unmistakable. We didn't say anything. We didn't need to. The fear in her eyes told me she'd come to the same conclusion. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of those tall, thin figures, their enormous black eyes staring down at me. I kept waking up in a cold sweat, convinced I could feel their presence in the room. At one point, I thought I heard Maddie whispering, but when I turned over, she was fast asleep. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the longer I lay there, the more certain I became that we weren't alone. There was this oppressive weight in the air, the same feeling I'd had back in the woods. I sat up and looked out the window, half expecting to see the glow again. Instead, there was nothing, just an empty parking lot bathed in moonlight. But the silence, it wasn't normal. It felt alive, like it was pressing in on me, suffocating me. I spent the rest of the night sitting in a chair by the door, my heart pounding with every creak of the building, every distant sound of a car passing by. By morning, I felt like I'd aged 10 years. None of us said a word as we packed up and left, but I could see it in their faces. We all knew that whatever had happened that night wasn't over. It had followed us, and I don't think it's ever truly gone. The drive home felt like we were moving through a fog, not just in the air but in our minds. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. My wife kept glancing at the kids, then at me, like she was trying to reassure herself that we were all still here, still us. Ethan broke the silence at one point, his voice quiet but steady, asking, "Do you think they'll come back?" The question sent a chill down my spine, but I didn't know how to answer. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror and saw the fear in his eyes. It wasn't just fear of what had already happened. It was fear of what might still come. I lied, saying, "No, it's over. We're safe now." But as the words left my mouth, I felt like I was tempting fate. Maddie didn't say a word. She just stared out the window, her little hands clutching the stuffed bear she'd brought along. That bear had been her comfort for years, but now it felt like it wasn't enough. I don't think anything would have been enough after what we'd been through. Once we got home, we tried to settle back into normal life, but nothing felt normal anymore. The house that used to feel warm and familiar now felt strange, like we didn't quite belong there. Maddie started having nightmares almost every night. She'd wake up screaming, saying things like, "They're here," or "Don't let them take me again." My wife and I would rush to her room trying to calm her down, but the fear in her eyes was so raw it made my stomach turn. Ethan wasn't much better. He started keeping a flashlight and a baseball bat by his bed, and he refused to sleep unless the hallway light was on. My wife tried to keep things together for the kids, but I could see the cracks in her facade. She'd spent hours staring at nothing, her hand absent-mindedly rubbing the mark on her arm. I wanted to talk about it with her, to try to make sense of everything, but every time I brought it up, she'd shut down, shaking her head and saying, "I don't want to think about it." And me? I started noticing things, little things that didn't make sense. The electronics in the house would glitch for no reason. The TV would turn on in the middle of the night, showing static even though it wasn't connected to an antenna. Lights would flicker, even though I'd replaced the bulbs. At first I chalked it up to bad wiring or random malfunctions, but then there were the sounds. Late at night, when the house was completely quiet, I'd hear faint clicking noises, almost like Morse code, but I couldn't figure out where they were coming from. The first time it happened, I thought it was just my imagination, but then it kept happening, always at the same time, just past midnight. I even tried recording it once, but the audio was blank, like the sound didn't exist outside my own head. The worst part was the dreams. They didn't come every night, but when they did, they felt just as real as that night in the woods. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing, with flashes of those enormous eyes burned into my mind. Sometimes, I'd feel phantom touches on my arms or legs, and I'd wake up with new marks, tiny dots in perfect patterns, like something was still experimenting on me. It wasn't long before I started questioning my sanity. I tried talking to my wife about the marks and the dreams, but she refused to engage, brushing it off as stress or nightmares. "We're all just shaken up," she'd say, but her voice lacked conviction, and the way she avoided looking at me told me she didn't believe her own words. I considered seeing a doctor, but what could I even say? "Hey, I think aliens abducted my family, and now I'm waking up with weird marks on my body." They'd lock me up in a heartbeat. So, I kept it to myself. I started checking my body every morning, documenting the marks with my phone, trying to find some kind of pattern or explanation. The strangest part was that the marks always healed, within a day or two, disappearing completely, like they'd never been there. But the memory of them lingered, and every time I found a new one, it felt like another piece of my reality was crumbling. I became hypervigilant, constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every sound. It felt like I was living in a constant state of paranoia, but the worst part was knowing I wasn't imagining it. Something had happened to us, and it wasn't over. One night, a few weeks after the trip, I woke up around 3 a.m. to a loud buzzing sound, like an electrical current surging through the house. My heart nearly stopped when I realized the room was bathed in a faint, pulsating blue light. I froze, too terrified to move as the light grew brighter, filling every corner of the room. My wife stirred beside me, her breathing quick and shallow, and I could tell she was awake but pretending to be asleep, like acknowledging it would make it real. I forced myself to sit up, my hands trembling as I reached for the window. The light wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from everywhere, like it was seeping through the walls. The buzzing grew louder, and just as I felt like my head was going to split open, it stopped. The light vanished, leaving the room in complete darkness. My wife let out a shaky breath, and I could hear her whispering a prayer under her breath. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I just sat there, waiting for something else to happen, but nothing did. When the sun came up, the world looked normal again, but I knew better. Normal didn't exist for us anymore. The final straw came a few days later. I was in the backyard, trying to fix the fence after a storm had knocked part of it down. It was a quiet afternoon, the kind of day that almost made me forget about everything we'd been through. But then I felt it, a strange tingling sensation at the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. I turned around, expecting to see one of the kids or my wife, but the yard was empty. The air felt heavy, charged with static, and for a split second, I thought I saw something out of the corner of my eye. It was tall and thin, just like in the dreams, but when I turned to look, it was gone. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding, but nothing else happened. That night, I told my wife we needed to leave the house. She thought I was being paranoid, but I could see the fear in her eyes. She agreed, reluctantly, and we started making plans to move. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever this was, it wasn't tied to a place. It was tied to us. To this day, I still don't have answers. We moved to a different state, changed our routines, even stopped camping altogether. But the feeling never went away. The marks still show up sometimes, though not as often as before. The dreams come and go, always the same. Bright lights, cold tables, and those unblinking eyes. Maddie and Ethan don't talk about it anymore, but I catch them glancing at the sky sometimes, their faces filled with the same quiet fear I feel. My wife refuses to discuss any of it, insisting we need to move on, but I can tell she hasn't forgotten. How could she? How could any of us? Whatever happened that night in the Rockies changed us, and not in a way I can explain. I've read stories online, found communities of people who've experienced similar things, but it doesn't bring me any comfort. If anything, it just confirms what I've been trying to deny. This wasn't a one-time thing. They chose us, for whatever reason, and I don't think they're done with us. I don't know when or if they'll come back, but one thing's for sure. I'll never feel safe again. Second story, Mountaineers in the Himalayas, 1997. I've climbed mountains for most of my adult life, but nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what happened on that climb in the Himalaya in 1997. It started like any other expedition. The crisp, biting cold, the weight of the gear pressing into my shoulders, and that ever-present hum of the wind whipping against the peaks. My partner, Liam, and I had been preparing for months, obsessively going over every detail, every possible mishap. But this wasn't on any checklist or survival guide. The day started early, around 4 a.m. We'd set out from the base camp, aiming to reach a midpoint by dusk. The weather was clear, almost unnervingly so. As the hours passed, the altitude began to take its toll, but we pressed on. By mid-afternoon, we were well above 6,000 meters, and that's when things began to feel off. I can't describe it fully, but there was this strange heaviness in the air, like the atmosphere was thicker somehow. Liam felt it too. He kept glancing over his shoulder as if someone or something was following us. I tried to shrug it off as altitude sickness playing tricks on us, but deep down, I knew this wasn't normal. Around 5 p.m., the light began to change. It wasn't the usual golden hue of the setting sun reflecting off the snow. It was different, more metallic, almost like the air itself was glowing. At first, I thought it was just my goggles fogging up or the light playing tricks on the ice, but then Liam grabbed my arm, his grip like a vice. "Do you see that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ahead of us, maybe 200 meters away, was a sphere of light. It was hovering, pulsing softly, like a heartbeat. I froze, my mind racing through every logical explanation. Was it some kind of weather phenomenon? A reflection? But no, it was moving, deliberate and slow, almost as if it was aware of us. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, watching this thing, and then, without warning, it shot up into the sky, disappearing into the clouds. Liam and I just stared at each other, both of us too stunned to speak. But the strangest part? As soon as it was gone, that heavy, oppressive feeling vanished, like flipping a switch. We decided to keep moving, mostly out of fear of staying in that spot any longer. Dusk was closing in, and we needed to find shelter. But as we trekked forward, the terrain began to change in ways that didn't make sense. The snow, which had been packed and even, turned into these strange, circular patterns, almost like crop circles but etched into the ice. I pointed it out to Liam, and he just shook his head, muttering something about it being a trick of the wind. But it wasn't just the snow. The air felt warmer, almost humid, a stark contrast to the freezing temperatures we'd been enduring all day. And then there was the silence. No wind, no crunch of our boots on the snow, nothing. It was as if the world around us had been muted. That's when we saw it, a structure in the distance, shimmering like a mirage. It looked impossible, smooth, glowing walls that seemed to ripple like water but held their shape. We didn't say a word. We just started walking toward it, as if we were being pulled by some invisible force. As we got closer to the structure, the air around it felt heavier again, But this time it wasn't oppressive. It was more like walking through thick water, every step deliberate and slow. The glowing walls, which at first had seemed far away, were now towering above us, stretching impossibly high into the sky. I remember touching one of them, expecting it to be cold or solid, but it wasn't either. It was warm, almost alive, and it gave under my hand like a thick gel before springing back into place. Liam was behind me, staring at the structure with this mix of awe and terror. "What is this?" he muttered, his voice shaking. I didn't have an answer, and I don't think he was really expecting one. The entrance, it wasn't a door exactly, more like a gap that opened on its own as we approached, beckoned us inside. Against every ounce of my better judgment, we stepped through, and that's when everything changed. The interior was vast, impossibly vast, like stepping into another world entirely. The walls, if you could call them that, radiated this soft, pulsating light that seemed to shift colors, gold, blue, white, soothing and disorienting at the same time. There was no visible ceiling, just an endless expanse of light above us. The floor wasn't solid either. It was like walking on air, but with enough resistance to hold our weight. And then they appeared. At first it was just a faint glow in the distance, but as they got closer, their forms became clear. They were tall, maybe 8 or 9 feet, with elongated limbs and a presence that was both calming and terrifying. They weren't humanoid exactly, but they weren't entirely alien either. Their bodies were translucent, almost like they were made of the same light as the walls, and their faces, or what I assumed were faces, had no features. Despite their lack of eyes or mouths, I could feel them looking at us, studying us. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, and I could tell Liam was in the same state. It wasn't fear holding me in place, though. It was something deeper, something I can't explain. One of them stepped closer to me, its movements smooth and deliberate. I wanted to back away, but my body wouldn't respond. It raised a long, glowing limb and touched my chest. The moment it made contact, my entire body lit up with warmth, like every cell was vibrating at once. I could feel everything. Memories I didn't even know I had came flooding back. Childhood moments, flashes of faces I hadn't thought about in years, even sensations like the smell of my grandmother's kitchen or the sound of rain on my old apartment window. It was overwhelming, like my entire life was being played back to me in an instant. And then it was gone. I gasped, staggering back, and realized I was crying. Liam was staring at me, wide-eyed, and I could tell from his expression that the same thing had just happened to him. The being stepped back, joining the others, and for a moment, they just stood there, as if waiting for something. Then, without a word or a sound, they began to fade, their forms dissolving into the walls. And just like that, we were alone, again, standing in the middle of that vast, glowing space. After they vanished, the space around us began to shift. The light that had been soft and pulsating turned brighter, harsher, almost blinding. The floor beneath our feet started to feel unstable, like it was dissolving. I grabbed Liam's arm, trying to anchor myself, but he looked as lost as I felt. That warm, almost peaceful feeling from earlier was gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of urgency, like we needed to leave immediately. The walls, if you could even call them that anymore, began to close in, or maybe they were just shrinking. I couldn't tell. The entire space felt alive, like it was reacting to us, and not in a good way. "We have to get out of here," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the growing hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Liam nodded, and we turned back toward the entrance, or where we thought the entrance had been. But it wasn't there anymore. Panic started to set in. The shimmering gap we had walked through was gone, replaced by more of that glowing, rippling surface. We tried moving in the direction we thought we had come from, but it was like walking through quicksand. Every step felt heavier, harder, like the space itself was resisting us. The hum grew louder, almost deafening, and I could feel it in my chest, vibrating through my bones. Liam started yelling, banging his fists against the walls, but it was useless. I was about to join him when the light around us suddenly dimmed, plunging the space into a kind of twilight. For a moment, I thought we were going to be trapped there forever. Then, out of nowhere, the floor beneath us gave way. It wasn't like falling. It was more like being pulled, yanked down by an unseen force. The sensation was disorienting, like being caught in a whirlpool, and all I could do was close my eyes and hope for the best. When I opened my eyes again, we were lying in the snow. The cold was the first thing I noticed, sharp and biting, a stark contrast to the warmth of that strange place. I sat up, gasping for air, and saw Liam next to me, shivering but conscious. We were back on the mountainside, though not where we had been before. Our gear was scattered around us, as if it had been dropped from a height, and the sky above was pitch black, filled with stars. I checked my watch and my stomach dropped. It had stopped at 6:47 p.m., the exact time we had entered that structure, but the date was wrong. 24 hours had passed. We had been gone an entire day, and neither of us had any memory of how we got back. Liam was shaking, muttering something I couldn't understand, and I was too dazed to respond. All I could think about was that place, those beings, and the overwhelming feeling that we had been changed somehow, though I didn't know how or why. We stayed there for a while, sitting in the snow, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My mind was racing, but nothing fit together. It felt like waking up from a dream, except I knew it wasn't a dream. My body still felt different, like I wasn't entirely back to normal. I couldn't shake the sensation of that warmth from when the being touched me, like it had left some kind of mark, though there was nothing visible on my skin. Liam wasn't much better. He kept staring at his hands, turning them over as if expecting to see something. Finally, he looked at me, his eyes wide and glassy. "Do you think anyone will believe us?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know what to say. Hell, I wasn't even sure I believed it myself, and I was there. We gathered our gear in silence, our movements slow and deliberate, like we were afraid to disturb whatever lingering presence might still be watching us. The trek back to base camp was agonizing. The terrain seemed different, like the mountain itself had shifted while we were gone. The snow patterns from before, the circular imprints, were nowhere to be seen, and the air felt eerily calm, almost sterile. It was as if the mountain had been wiped clean of any evidence of what we'd experienced. By the time we stumbled into camp, it was early morning, and the rest of the team was in a frenzy. Apparently, they'd been searching for us all night. One of the guides, a seasoned climber who had seen his fair share of strange things, pulled us aside and asked what had happened. Liam opened his mouth to speak, but stopped, shaking his head. I stepped in, muttering something about getting lost in the snowstorm. It felt like a betrayal to lie, but I couldn't bring myself to explain. How could I? They'd think we'd lost our minds, or worse, that we were making it up for attention. Over the next few days, Liam and I barely spoke. We were too shaken, too confused to process what had happened, let alone discuss it. But the silence didn't help. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of that place. The glowing walls, the beings, the feeling of being completely exposed, yet somehow at peace. It was haunting. I started to notice little things too, subtle, almost imperceptible changes in myself. My sense of time felt warped, like hours would pass in what felt like minutes, and vice versa. My dreams were vivid and strange, filled with images and sounds I couldn't place. Liam mentioned similar things in passing, but we didn't dwell on it. We both knew there were no answers, at least not ones we'd find out there on the mountain. By the time we returned to civilization, we'd made an unspoken pact to keep it to ourselves. Whatever had happened up there, it wasn't something the world was ready to hear, or something we were ready to share. Even after we returned home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't just the dreams or the distorted sense of time. It was deeper than that, like a part of me had been left behind in that glowing structure. Or maybe something from there had come back with me. My body felt different. I was stronger, more alert, like my senses had been heightened. Colors seemed brighter, sounds sharper, and I could feel this strange hum in the back of my mind, like static that wouldn't go away. At first I thought it was just stress or residual trauma, but as the weeks went on, it only grew stronger. Liam called me one night, his voice frantic. "Do you feel it?" he asked, not even bothering with a greeting. I knew exactly what he meant. We both tried to explain it to each other, but words didn't seem to do it justice. It wasn't pain or discomfort. It was just there, an ever-present reminder of what had happened. Over time, little things began to happen that I couldn't explain. Electronics around me would glitch out for no reason. My phone would freeze, lights would flicker, and my computer would crash randomly. At first, I chalked it up to bad luck or coincidence, but it became harder to ignore. One night, I was lying in bed when the hum in my mind grew louder, almost unbearable. I sat up, clutching my head, and suddenly, the lamp on my nightstand shattered, the bulb exploding in a burst of light. I just sat there, stunned, staring at the broken glass. Moments like that became more frequent, and I started to wonder if whatever those beings had done to us had left some kind of imprint. Liam was experiencing similar things, though he refused to talk about it in detail. "We shouldn't have gone in," he told me once, his voice shaking. "We weren't meant to see that. The hardest part has been the isolation. It's not just the fear of being called crazy. It's the knowledge that no one else could possibly understand. Even now, years later, I still feel that hum, that strange presence lingering at the edges of my mind. I've tried to move on, to live a normal life, but it's impossible. Every so often, I'll see something, a flash of light, a shadow out of the corner of my eye, and it all comes rushing back. I can't even look at the stars anymore without feeling like I'm being watched. I've thought about going back to the mountains, to that place, to try and find answers, but the thought terrifies me. What if it's still there? What if they're still there, waiting? I don't know if I could handle it. Liam and I haven't spoken in years. The last time we talked, he said he was moving out to the countryside, away from people, away from anything that could remind him of that day. I can't blame him. Sometimes I think about doing the same. I don't know what they wanted from us, or why they let us go. Maybe it was some kind of experiment, or maybe they were just curious. I've read stories online about other people who claim to have experienced similar things, but nothing quite like this. Most days, I try to convince myself it wasn't real, that it was just a hallucination brought on by the altitude and exhaustion. But deep down, I know the truth. I feel it every time I close my eyes and see that glowing structure, every time. I hear that faint hum in the back of my mind. Whatever happened to us on that mountain, it wasn't meant for human eyes. And yet we saw it. We were a part of it, if only for a moment. I don't know if I'll ever find peace with it, but one thing is certain: I'll never climb another mountain again. If you're enjoying this and want to support the channel in bringing more spine-chilling stories like this, any contribution is greatly appreciated. The donation link is pinned in the first comment, and even the smallest support means so much. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Third story: The Old Man in the Amazon Rainforest. 1964. It all started with what was supposed to be a simple hunting trip. I had ventured deeper into the forest than usual, chasing after signs of game that had been scarce for weeks. The air was thick with humidity, and the towering trees created a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. I remember feeling uneasy, as though the forest had gone eerily quiet. No birds, no insects, not even the rustle of leaves. It was just me, and the sound of my own breathing. That's when I noticed the strange markings on the ground. They weren't like any animal tracks I'd ever seen. The shapes were irregular, almost geometric, and they seemed to form a kind of path. Something about them drew me in, like they were leading me somewhere. Against my better judgment, I followed them. The deeper I went, the stranger everything became. The air felt charged, almost electric, and a faint hum began to vibrate through the forest. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, like it was coming from the ground itself. My hands started to tremble, and I clutched my rifle tighter, scanning the dense undergrowth for movement. That's when I saw them, 3 figures standing in a small clearing ahead. At first, I thought they were people, maybe other hunters, or tribespeople. But as I stepped closer, I realized they were anything but human. Their bodies were slender but muscular, covered in patches of fur that shimmered under the dim light. Their faces were a grotesque blend of human and animal features, with elongated jaws and eyes that glowed faintly yellow. They moved in perfect unison, almost mechanically, turning their heads to look at me at the exact same time. I froze, unable to move or speak. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. One of them raised an arm. Its hand had long, claw-like fingers and pointed directly at me. I didn't hear a voice, but I felt something invade my mind, a presence that wasn't my own. Images and emotions flooded me in a chaotic wave. Bright, unearthly lights, feelings of helplessness, and a strange metallic taste in my mouth. Before I could react, the humming sound grew louder, and the world around me seemed to bend and twist. The trees blurred, the ground felt like it was tilting, and then everything went dark. The last thing I remember was the sensation of being lifted, like I was weightless, floating upward into the oppressive silence. When I woke up, I was lying on a cold, smooth surface. The air around me was heavy and sterile, with a faint metallic tang that made me nauseous. My body felt paralyzed, but my senses were sharp. I could see the strange, dimly lit chamber I was in. The walls were a seamless, grayish-white material that seemed to pulse faintly, as though it were alive. Above me, there were bright, circular lights that didn't seem to cast any shadows, which made everything feel surreal. My eyes darted around, and that's when I saw them again. The same creatures from the forest. They surrounded me, their movements fluid and unnerving. One leaned closer, its face inches from mine. I could see every detail now, the way its fur seemed to grow and retract subtly like breathing, the unnerving intelligence in its glowing eyes. They didn't speak, at least not out loud, but the pressure in my head returned, stronger this time. It was like they were communicating directly with my thoughts, forcing images and sensations into my mind. I felt exposed, like every memory and feeling I'd ever had was being sifted through and examined. I tried to scream, to fight back, but my body wouldn't respond. Then, without warning, one of them extended a tool, something long and sharp, yet not quite metallic. It shimmered as if it were made of liquid and solid at the same time. They brought it close to my chest, and I felt a burning sensation as it touched my skin. It wasn't pain exactly, but it was deeply uncomfortable, like it was altering something inside me. I could feel it probing, moving, almost like it was alive. At some point, I must have blacked out again, because when I came to, I was no longer in that chamber. I was outside, back in the forest, lying on the damp ground. The sky above me was still dark, but there was a strange glow in the distance, fading as if something massive had just departed. My entire body ached, and there were strange marks on my arms and chest. Tiny, perfectly circular indentations that didn't bleed but burned when touched. My rifle was gone, and so was my sense of direction. I had no idea how long I'd been gone, but the forest felt different, like it was watching me. Every shadow seemed to move. Every rustle felt deliberate. I stumbled through the trees, desperate to find my way back, the weight of what had happened pressing down on me like a stone. After what felt like hours of aimless wandering, I finally stumbled upon a familiar trail. My legs were weak, and every step sent jolts of pain through my body. The marks on my skin throbbed in time with my heartbeat, and the memory of that tool, whatever it was, kept flashing in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that those things were still watching me from the shadows. Occasionally, I'd hear faint noises, whispers that didn't sound like human voices, rustling in the underbrush that stopped the moment I turned my head. The forest, once a place I had always felt comfortable in, now felt alien and hostile. The air itself seemed heavier, harder to breathe. I focused on putting one foot in front of the other, knowing that if I stopped, I might lose myself entirely. When I finally emerged from the forest, it was near dawn. The light of the rising sun should have been comforting, but it wasn't. Everything felt wrong, like I was seeing the world through a distorted lens. My small village came into view, and I felt a wave of relief, but it was short-lived. As I approached, I realized I couldn't just walk in and tell anyone what had happened. Who would believe me? An old man claiming to have been taken by creatures that were neither human nor animal. They'd laugh, call me crazy, maybe even lock me up. So I kept quiet, stumbling into my hut and collapsing onto my cot. My body was exhausted, but my mind refused to rest. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them again. Those glowing yellow eyes, the shimmering tool, the suffocating presence in my mind. The days that followed were a blur. I avoided the other villagers, claiming I was sick if anyone asked, but I could feel their eyes on me, their suspicion growing as they noticed how withdrawn I had become. The marks on my body didn't fade. If anything, they seemed to become more pronounced, as if they were etched deeper into my skin. Worse, I began experiencing strange sensations, tingling in my hands and feet, flashes of light when I closed my eyes, and an almost magnetic pull toward the forest. It was like whatever they had done to me wasn't finished, like I was still connected to them somehow. At night, I'd wake up drenched in sweat, the faint hum I'd heard in the forest echoing in my ears. No matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were waiting, watching, and that this wasn't over. By the end of the first week, I began to notice changes that went beyond the marks on my skin or the strange sensations coursing through my body. It was subtle at first. My hearing seemed sharper, and I could pick up on sounds I'd never noticed before, like the faint rustle of leaves, even when the air was still. My vision, too, was different. At night, I could see the outlines of trees and shadows as if there was a faint glow illuminating everything. But these changes didn't feel like gifts. They felt like intrusions, as though I was becoming something I didn't understand. The villagers were starting to ask more questions. Some of them whispered that I was cursed. Others avoided me altogether. One night, a neighbor came by to check on me, and as I opened the door, I saw his face change. He looked at me like he was staring at a ghost, or something worse. He didn't say much, just muttered an excuse and left in a hurry, but the way he kept glancing over his shoulder told me everything I needed to know. Whatever was happening to me, it was visible to others in ways I couldn't see. The dreams were the worst part. Every time I managed to fall asleep, I was back in that chamber, surrounded by those creatures. The lights above me pulsed, the walls seemed to shift and breathe, and that tool hovered inches above my chest, glowing faintly as it moved with a life of its own. In the dreams, I couldn't move or scream, just like in real life. But there was something else, a presence that I hadn't noticed before. It felt larger, darker, like it was watching from somewhere just beyond the walls of that place. It didn't need a body. Its presence alone was suffocating. The dreams always ended the same way. The sound of that hum growing louder and louder until it was unbearable. And then a blinding flash of light that jolted me awake. My heart would be pounding, my body drenched in sweat, and the marks on my skin would burn like they were freshly made. I stopped trying to sleep after a while, afraid of what I might see or feel if I closed my eyes for too long. Eventually, I couldn't resist the pull of the forest any longer. It wasn't like I wanted to go back, but something inside me was relentless, dragging me toward the place where it had all started. I waited until nightfall, when the villagers were asleep, and slipped out without making a sound. The forest was different at night, even more alive than I remembered. The air felt charged again, the same way it had before they appeared. My skin prickled, and I could hear that faint hum in the distance, growing louder the deeper I went. Every step felt like a step toward something inevitable, and though I was terrified, I couldn't stop myself. The trees seemed to close in around me, the darkness pressing against my vision despite the strange clarity my eyes now had. And then, just as I reached the clearing where I'd first seen them, the humming stopped. The silence was so sudden, so absolute, that it felt like the entire forest was holding its breath. I stood there, heart pounding, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. There were no lights, no figures stepping out of the shadows, just the oppressive silence and the weight of their absence. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still there, watching from just beyond the edge of my perception. I stood in that clearing for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. The silence wasn't comforting. It was oppressive, almost tangible, as though the entire forest was bracing for something. I kept expecting them to appear, to step out from behind the trees or materialize in front of me the way they had before. But nothing happened. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was like they were there, just out of sight, observing me, waiting for something. My skin prickled, and the marks on my arms and chest started to ache again, a deep, pulsing pain that seemed to radiate through my entire body. I felt like I was being pulled apart, like whatever they had done to me was reaching its climax. And then, out of nowhere, the hum returned. It started as a low vibration, barely audible, but it grew rapidly, filling the clearing and making my teeth chatter. Before I could react, the ground beneath me seemed to shift, like it was no longer solid. My vision blurred, and the world around me started to warp again, just like it had the first time. The trees bent and twisted, their forms stretching unnaturally as the humming reached a deafening crescendo. My body felt weightless, but instead of floating upward like before, I felt like I was being pulled inward, like the forest itself was swallowing me. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The hum, the shifting, the weightlessness, it was all gone. I was back in the clearing, but everything felt different. The air was heavier, the trees were darker, and the silence wasn't just silence, it was absence. Whatever had been there before, it was gone now, completely and utterly. I dropped to my knees, gasping for air, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I was alone. I don't remember how I made it back to the village. The journey is a blur. My memory's fractured and disjointed. When I finally stumbled into my hut, I collapsed onto the floor, my body trembling and my mind racing. The marks on my skin were still there, but they didn't burn anymore. Instead, they felt cold, like they had drained something from me. Over the next few days, I tried to piece together what had happened, but the harder I thought about it, the less sense it made. The villagers continued to avoid me, their whispers growing louder and more accusatory. I stopped going outside, too afraid of their stares and their questions. The forest, once my refuge, was now a place I couldn't even look at without feeling sick. Whatever those creatures had done to me, whatever they had taken or left behind, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't the same anymore. And no matter how hard I tried to forget, I knew they weren't done with me. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Even now, years later, I can still feel their presence, like a shadow that never quite leaves. The marks on my skin have faded, but I can still see them when I look closely, like scars etched into my very being. The dreams haven't stopped either. Sometimes they're vivid, pulling me back into that chamber with the pulsing walls and the glowing lights. Other times they're just flashes, yellow eyes, shimmering tools, the overwhelming hum that seems to echo through my bones. I've tried to move on, to pretend that it was all a bad dream or some kind of hallucination, but deep down, I know the truth. They're still out there, watching, waiting, and I can't shake the feeling that one day they'll come back for me. So, what did you think of this story? Did it scare you? Was there a part that gave you chills or stuck with you the most? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below. If you have had a similar experience or have suggestions for future horror stories, let me know too. Thank you for watching and being part of this amazing community. See you in the next story.